Hi, I'm Professor Ken Hiltner, but please call me Ken. I want to talk about one of the books that I'm currently reading, Henry David Thoreau's 1854 Walden. As I teach it every fall, I've reread this book each of the past 15 years. But before jumping into Walden, I want to address, sort of the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is, in fact, the room that I'm in. It's a real room. This isn't a green screen behind me. I am, in fact, in my backyard in this little building. Hi, this is me. I'm in my backyard in this little building that I built a few years ago. And there's, interestingly, a Henry David Thoreau connection because ever since reading Walden in my early teens, I wanted to build a little cabin like Thoreau, and this is it. During COVID, I often spend, half of my waking hours out in this little building. Any event. Okay, Walden, Thoreau. What a mess. And by that I don't mean Walden or Thoreau is a mess. I mean that Walden and Thoreau are both messes. So you may be familiar with some of the glaring problems here. So where to start? Well, Thoreau talks about Walden Pond as if it were wilderness. In fact, it's just a mile outside of Concord, Massachusetts, the little town where he lived. Hardly wilderness, more like a park. Thoreau talks a lot about solitude, the wilderness solitude of Walden Pond. In fact, he had visitors nearly every day and walked home frequently, which took about 20 minutes for his mom's home-cooked dinners. Thoreau talks quite a bit about why he chose to live his life at Walden Pond. In fact, he lived there for only a couple years of his life, then spent the rest of it in a pretty conventional way. In short, the life of wilderness solitude that Thoreau paints in Walden is, let's be kind, not quite accurate. Then there's the whole civil disobedience thing. Thoreau made much of the fact that while at Walden Pond he was arrested and put in jail as a result of his protest of slavery. In fact, he spent just one night in jail. And I'm sorry, but while Thoreau's heart may certainly have been in the right place, in a century where millions of Americans were born and died in captivity, it's hard to sympathize with the hardships that Thoreau experienced during his night in captivity. In general, it's hard to sympathize with Thoreau, as in so many ways his life was one marked by privilege. He never tires of drawing attention to the fact that at Walden Pond he lived a life of, poverty. True, but in fact, Thoreau came from a pretty wealthy family. He was educated at Harvard. A few years ago, a student of mine, Riley, noted that bookstores are littered with how to get rich manuals for people without much money. Walden is also a how-to manual. How to live like you don't have any money, when in fact you have, or at least your family has, quite a bit. In short, poverty was a game, a dalliance for Thoreau, rather than an inescapable reality of life, as it was, and still is, for so many Americans. Thoreau was privileged by more than the virtue of the fact that he had money, by the way. True, Walden Pond was hardly wilderness, but it was secluded some distance from any neighbors. 170 years ago, it would have simply not been safe for a woman, a person of color, an ex-slave, or any number of people to live alone in such an isolated place. Honestly, I'm not sure things have improved all that much in this regard in intervening years. Walden is, of course, also ableist. How exactly did he live Thoreau's lifestyle in a wheelchair, or certain medical conditions, or if you're elderly? And then there's Thoreau's personality. As journalist Catherine Scholes provocatively argued in a New Yorker article a few years ago, Thoreau was, by all accounts, a jerk, not someone with whom you would want to spend much time. Similarly, in the Apple TV show Dickinson, after meeting Thoreau, the title character concludes that he is indeed a dick. Sorry, that's not my word. It's hers. Not Emily Dickinson's word. It's extraordinarily unlikely she actually met Thoreau, but rather the impression voiced by the actress Hilly Steinfeld in the show Dickinson. Anyhow, shifting to Walden, the book. At times it's really hard to get through the text, as the writing is, nearly unreadable. I keep kidding that one day I will do a translation of Walden. The joke is that Walden is just 165 years old. Its modern English should present few challenges, and yet hardly a pleasant read. It can be downright difficult to get through at times. There's an even bigger problem with Thoreau, as I've argued in my most recent book on writing a new environmental era. 15 miles, and that's just a day's walk. North of Walden Pond lies Lowell, Massachusetts. By the time Walden was published in 1854, Lowell had become the largest industrial center in the United States. The problem is that Lowell is not mentioned in Walden, not even once. Thoreau's response to the industrial juggernaut steaming through his era, it was to turn away from it and flee to the imagined simplicity of a bygone way of life. That was a cop-out. Then as now, we need to turn to face the problems of modernity. And environmentally, there are a slew of them, head on, rather than run away from them. Okay, by now, you're no doubt wondering why in the world I'm suggesting that you read Walden when I'm clearly of the opinion that it and Thoreau are a mess. The fact is that Walden is one of the most important books that I've ever read. In some ways, perhaps the most important. That's why I keep reading it and assigning it. And while I would argue that my students should all pick it up at some point, I can think of absolutely no better time than COVID-19. Seriously, this book was written for COVID. Why? In order to explain, first watch what I'm doing. I'm pointing you somewhere. Let's see if I can point over here so you can see what I'm doing. I'm pointing you to my backpack, directing you to examine it. Once you clearly see where I'm pointing, you begin examining it. My hand becomes largely irrelevant. You might be grateful to me in my hand for pointing you there, but that's really not the point. The point is what I'm pointing you towards. That's what really matters. It's all too easy to focus on Thoreau and Walden and their faults. It's also largely a waste of time. Instead, we need to attend to where Thoreau is pointing us, to what he is encouraging us to do, what he wants us to examine. Where Thoreau is pointing us, and this is a real twist, is back to ourselves. That's what he is asking each of us to do, somewhat paradoxically, is to step outside of our lives so that we can examine our lives in detail. I know, this can sound pretty facile. Writers and thinkers have been encouraging us to do self-examination for thousands of years. Socrates did it. Plenty of people after him did it. But Thoreau is different. This is not a thought experiment. This is a call to change how you live your life. Think of life like a play, a theatrical performance that's been scripted for you. When you were born, you stepped into a role, exceptionally intricate. It was written long before you were ever conceived. What you would live, how you would live, where you would live, how you'd get around, what you would eat. This was all spelled out in detail. It's not that you weren't given some latitude in playing the role. For example, modern days, you can choose the car that you want. However, you can't usually choose to forgo having a car, not if you want to play the role successfully, to be thought of as a success. Like most people, we live the life scripted for us. Thoreau is urging us to step outside of the role and carefully examine the script. Moreover, he is urging us to do something that very few people do, to write our own script. How to begin? What did Thoreau do? Well, he began by disrupting his life. He stepped, outside of his life in a way that stepped outside of the script, so that he could take some time to examine the role scripted for him. Does that mean that we all need to, go camp out in the local park for a year or two in order to affect the disruption of our lives? No need, as a major disruption to all our lives has swept across the planet, COVID-19. With all the immense hardship and horrors that have come with COVID, and they are certainly many. An opportunity, I would argue an obligation, has also come up for those of us who are in privileged positions to examine our lives and reflect on our many privileges. Thoreau sadly fails to address his privileges. Perhaps this is his most glaring failing. Let that be a cautionary tale to us. But seemingly everywhere you go, people keep saying that in response to COVID that they can't wait to get their lives back. But do we want our lives back? After he had walked away from his cushy life to a Spartan one on the shores of Walden Pond, Thoreau spent the next 2 years asking himself this very question. In other words, after the day-to-day life that he took for granted was disrupted, he was able to turn in on life itself to ask if he wanted it back. Although the opening of Walden Pond is taking up with quite a bit of musing on the subject at the title of this thing, the title of the second chapter really underscores Thoreau's project here, and that is Where I Lived and What I Lived For. It's incidentally a good example of where Thoreau would really need a modern translation, because after listening to him ramble on and on about himself in the opening chapter, you may well groan when you turn the page and read this heading, as it makes clear that he's going to continue on and on about himself for another chapter. A far better approach would be to title that second chapter, Where Do You Live? What do you live for? After all, this book is, as far as I am concerned, really about the reader, not Thoreau, the writer. Let's jump to that second question first. Do you really know what you live for? Well, is it wealth? Is it leisure, fame, pleasure, prestige? Well, you might expect Thoreau's discussion of what he lives for to take a philosophical turn, and certainly Thoreau is given to his share of philosophical musings. He instead focuses on something that few philosophers in the Western tradition had arguably done before him. He returns to the day-to-day. Thoreau not only takes a long, hard look at the seemingly mundane issues of where he lives, but what he eats, what he wears, how he gets around, the stuff he makes or buys, and so forth. And as he quickly concludes that his life is excessively complicated and bloated, he's able to offer up a prescription for a better life. It takes the form of an imperative that, amazingly, Thoreau has reduced to a single word. For emphasis, he repeats it twice. Simplify, simplify. In so doing, Thoreau is in many respects the great-grandparent of the modern minimalist movement. Thoreau argues that a simpler life is a better life, a happier life. In part, this is because having less means that we do not need to work nearly as much, inquiring ever more. In Thoreau's era, the standard work week was 6 days with 1 day, Sunday, off. By living a simple life, Thoreau suggests you could work just 1 day a week and have the rest of the week for, well, living and enjoying life. As Thoreau argued with respect to fashion, a range of industries convince us to buy and consume tons of stuff with one goal in mind. And these are Thoreau's remarkable words, and they're not mine. They sound very modern. The goal of these corporations is unquestionably that the corporations themselves may be enriched. In other words, although corporations, through careful marketing, try to convince us that we will profit from the things that they sell us, it is actually, as Thoreau clearly saw, the other way around. They're the only ones that really profit. Consumerism doesn't make us happy, rather just the opposite. I should confess to why Thoreau particularly resonates with me on this count. I am, to be honest, obsessed with the climate crisis. If you take Thoreau's prescription to simplify, not only might it, as he suggests, make you happier, it can make for a far happier planet. If you're an average American, a third of your carbon climate footprint comes from your house. A quarter comes from transportation, principally having a car. Another quarter comes from all the stuff that we relentlessly consume, and another big chunk from the food that we eat. If we all took Thoreau's prescription to simplify by reconsidering where we lived, how we got around, the stuff we buy, what we eat, and so forth, we could reduce our carbon footprint by a factor of 10. I'm not talking about moving out to a cabin somewhere. People can and have done this in cities and even suburbs. So what's the magic key here? Well, I have a whole course that takes up this question, but I can cut to the chase and give you an answer in 2 simple words. Simplify, simplify. See, you didn't need to take English 23. That's it. But that's life from the outside. It's also the case that Thoreau argues that, this can bring about an inner transformation in each of us. So Jon Kabat-Zinn, one of the chief architects of modern mindfulness, wonderfully sums up Thoreau in this count. Allow me to quote from him. At this, and if I can get it here, when Thoreau says, it was morning, and lo, now it is evening, and nothing memorable is accomplished, this is waving a red flag in front of a bull for go-getting, progress-oriented people. That would be people like us. Thoreau was singing a song that needed hearing then as much as it does now. He is, to this day, continually pointing out, for anyone willing to listen, the deep importance of contemplation and of non-attachment to any result other than the sheer enjoyment of being. Well, if that sounds a little Buddhist, it is, as both Thoreau and Kabat-Zinn were much influenced by the Buddha's approach to life. So, probably gone a little long here now that I look at the time. I should stop. But look, Thoreau was certainly a flawed person. Walden is a flawed book. Nonetheless, it is a remarkable and important book, not because of what it does, but because of what it encourages each of us to do. You can read it free online. Dover has a nice paperback edition that costs $5. But you really don't need to read the whole book. The first 2 chapters are, in my opinion, the most important. I definitely think that it's worth an hour or 2 of your time. Okay, I think that's it. Thanks.